Okay, so for today we're going to talk about exploring the spoiled and celebrated identities of young homeless drug users. So that is, so in a lot of ways this article is kind of like examining things that we were already kind of started talking about with social psychology, right? Like what are our roles, where does our identity come from? But there's something different about this identity than a lot of the ones we talked about before. What's the difference here? What kind of identities are these? Do you guys need like a few moments to look back over because it's been long enough? Or? Yeah.
Spoiled identities?
Yeah, spoiled identities. What do we mean by that? What does it mean to have a spoiled identity? There's another term that gets thrown around here for this. Stigma. So how does a spoiled identity differ from a different kind of identity?
A spoiled identity basically is greatly affected by certain labels or certain perspectives that people have on like things that characterize that identity, if that makes sense.
It does. So like, but I think that would apply for like our regular identities, right? So like, what I think about students would change how people would think about, or how I, in this case, would think about you guys as students, right? Like, so I think that would still work. There's something unique about spoiled identities, or stigmatized identities. What is it?
I don't think that can't be fixed.
Well, it's not that they can't be fixed.
It's like it also affects the way that you see your own identity.
But that's also true, right? So like with all my identities, like my identity is as a son, right? Affects how I see myself as a person, right? So I'll venture it a different way. So like, how does being a son or daughter as an identity differ from being a heroin addict as an identity?
It doesn't negatively impact the way that you see yourself.
Yeah. So spoiled identities or stigmatized identities are essentially negative identities, right? They're identities that the meaning ascribed to them is basically is bad, right? The meaning we ascribe to them is bad. We don't like that identity. Okay, well, so what may some other stigmatized and spoiled identities be? What does our society look down on people who do what? There's a lot of these. Our society's full of them.
Are you talking about like stereotypes? Or what are you trying, like, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so what are certain roles or identities that people have ascribed to them, labels that we give people that are negative?
Like an alcoholic?
Could be an alcoholic. What else? And some of these may be things that we feel positively about, and we're going to look some of these stigmatized identities the participants he interacts with actually feel positive about. But what else might be some stigmatized or spoiled identities? Things that people hide.
Mental illness?
Mental illness, yeah. We often, you can really think of anything that people would say in a negative, like as an insult to you. Like, you call somebody crazy, right? That's essentially the stigmatization of mental illness, right? So people who are mentally ill have to hide the fact that they're mentally ill, right? It's not an acceptable thing to be. It becomes a part of their identity, right? It becomes a part of how they understand themselves, right? What else might be some negative, some stigmatized identities? Stigmatized labels.
just like what this article talked about, just like being homeless or like not having a lot of money.
Yeah, being homeless, being poor, like that's another identity that often like we stigmatize, right? And especially in our own culture, like in some societies, they don't stigmatize being poor so much, you know. Being poor can even be seen as, you know, a value or a blessing, right? Like, I think about like, when I was in Senegal, there was a novel coming out at the time where it's basically like, if there was no homeless people, what would our society be like? And it's basically this negative thing that essentially like people would, in essence, like go to hell because there wouldn't be anybody to help, right? Which is a very different way of thinking about poverty, right? Like in their culture. In our culture, what do we assume about people who are poor? That they're what? Yeah, that's what we say in our culture. Poor people are lazy, right? Poor people are lazy, they don't deserve anything they get, right? That's basically like, so like culturally, like that's a very stigmatized identity to have, right? So we think about homeless people. They bring this up at the very beginning in the intro. So like the history of homelessness, right? The birth of the term homeless was originally something to like make sure that there's like a call to arms, like there's something wrong with our society, there's all these people sleeping on the street, like let's help them, right? But the downside to that is it's very stigmatized, right? So if you're homeless, you carry around a negative identity, right? Along with any other series of negative identities, right? And by negative, I don't mean necessarily that it's bad. What I mean is just that we convey meaning that it is bad within our own culture. So that's what they mean, right? So like something like being young is in here, right? Like that's the last one of our identities in the article, right? You can be proud to be young. Being young is not inherently bad, right? But to some degree we do stigmatize it within our own culture. We place bounds on it. The way we talk about young people, right, is often negative. Right? You think about like if you look at the news, right, like it's all these things about how young people don't know how to talk to each other. They are just stuck in their electronic devices. All these prejudices that essentially older people have about young people, which by the way are not really all that true, right? But their prejudices construct that as a negative identity, right? That you have to deal with in one way or another. So that makes sense? And also thinking about like you had said like the idea of like you're stuck in it. Well, not necessarily, right? And youth is a great example of that. Eventually all of you will not be young. It's a negative identity that you lose slowly over time, right? Like when you're a teenager, it's probably at its height, right? And then you slowly lose it, right? And you become sort of acclimated into adulthood, and you lose a negative identity. You gain more power within our society the older you get. Make sense? Does that make sense? Okay, so how the really like the entire literature that this takes part in is something called Salvation of Self. Literature, which is the question of how do people deal with these identities, right? How are they dealing with that? What are the strategies that people have? Because like the idea is this, like, is it easy for people to, this is really obvious, right? Is it easy for people to feel bad about themselves? Or is it easy on them to feel bad about themselves? No, it isn't, right? So like all of us find some way of preserving a positive concept of self, despite any of these labels we may get, right? Everyone thinks that they're a good person, for the most part. Right? Everyone thinks that they're valuable on some level, right? And how is it that we maintain feeling that? Sometimes against astronomical odds, right? Okay. Any questions so far, or thoughts so far? I'm just kind of like moving us slowly through the article. So this is embedded within Goffman, right? The performance of self. How does a performance change if it's something you want to hide, right? Is another way we could think about this interaction. Did anybody catch this? It's on page 77. This discreditable versus discredited identity. distinction being made here. It's on the, if you're looking at the page, it's on the top paragraph on the right column.
It says like discreditable people are concerned, like they wanna hide their flaws and like them conceal, but discredited people, like just manage their like spoiled identity.
Yeah, so a discreditable identity, so these are both forms of stigma, right? You could have a stigmatized identity that's discreditable or discredited. So what's the distinction between these two? Other than, like, you mentioned, and we'll get around back to that, like the outcome of that. But what does one mean in the other?
I feel like the people that you interviewed later on in the article are an example of the discreditable in that one, because they kind of embrace, I think I'm saying the right thing, right, those. Yes, because they kind of embrace their negative stigmas.
Yeah.
And the discredited are more like, they recognize their stigmas, but they kind of put them down.
You're picking up on a major theme that we will definitely have to get to later, but I'm going to bracket that. And this is role embrace in role distance.
Is that still kind of a difference though, between discreditable and discredited?
I think that which one you're likely to do is connected
Okay.
to which one you have, right? But like, then some of these are a separate distinction. But I do think that they're interrelated, so you're not wrong in pointing that out. Okay, so get back to it. Any other attempts at discredited versus discreditable? If we just look at it linguistically, like if you just look at the words, what might be the difference?
So discredited is like already disproved, but like if it's discreditable, like it can be, but is it
Yeah, this one can't be avoided. If you have a discredited identity, you can't avoid the label. If it's discreditable, you can avoid. And the term that gets used in social psychology often for avoiding your identity is called passing. So it's passing. Initially, the first time that, we already talked a little bit about Goffman. This entire literature grows up out of one of Goffman's book called Stigma, in which he spent a lot of time with people who were disabled, right, as his example, and then dealt with ways in which they dealt with their disabilities. Well, how might we think, if we're to think about it in terms of disabilities rather than the article that we're in, what might be the difference between having a discreditable identity as somebody who's disabled versus a discredited identity as somebody who's disabled? What might be an example of somebody who's disabled that it's so obvious that they can't avoid the label?
Like when they have like a wheelchair or something?
If somebody has a wheelchair, they can't hide that, right? Yeah.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah. Or like if you're thinking about mentally disabled, somebody with Down syndrome can't usually hide the fact that they have Down syndrome, right? You might be able to pass with other things. Like I had a good friend who had autism, right? One of my friends in grad school had autism. Really great sociologist. But like he had a mild enough case of autism that people just thought he was awkward or strange, right? So he would hide that identity and not really like tell people that he had it so that he would avoid the stigma of having autism, right? That would be an example of passing, right? Or like if you are like the difference between being in a wheelchair or having a missing limb, somebody with a missing limb may not want people to know and hide that very well and only tell people that they feel comfortable telling, right? That's in essence passing. Now, none of this is meant to be insulting to the people who have these issues, right? It's more just like figuring out like how is it that that people deal with it, right? Because like we often don't think very positively of people with disabilities, or we think about mental disabilities. If you think that somebody's mentally disabled, do you necessarily believe what they're going to tell you most of the time? It says a lot. It says more about us than it does them, but often we will not, right? So there's an advantage to passing. Getting back to homelessness, I knew a fair number of homeless people when I was in Richmond, Virginia. I just sort of like started striking up conversations with people because I lived in an urban neighborhood and actually became friends with quite a few of them. But you would notice that like people who hadn't been on the street very long would find ways of passing. So they would find ways of hiding the fact that they were homeless and try to present as if they weren't to people, right? As opposed to people who had been out there a really long time. They were so dependent on panhandling for money usually that they had no way of actually hiding what they were, right? They had no other source of revenue, etc., right? That would be the difference in terms of homeless. The people who can pass, who can pretend that they're not homeless and get by, those people are discreditable. Like they have an identity that's negative. If people find out, right, then it would negatively impact them, right? As opposed to the people who had been there longer and they're discredited. They have a discredited identity. We all actually possess, in some minor way, forms of stigma, you know? So thinking about this as a literature, it's more like you could think of it as like you're looking at extreme examples, but this, as well as most of social psychology, this is supposed to be somewhat universal, right? So each one of us in this room has things about us we would prefer to not have people know, right? And we pass. We also have things that are embarrassing that we can't hide, and we have to use different strategies for those. You know, does that make sense? So like, you know, regardless of, then it can be really minor, like if I'm being like honest about myself and identities I have, you know, I have attention deficit disorder, right? I can hide that, generally speaking. Most people just write it off as me being, especially at this point in my life, as me being absent-minded, partially because of the profession I'm in, right? And so I can pass and pretend that I'm not, and most people wouldn't know. You guys only know because I told you, right? On the other hand, I can't hide the fact that I'm socially awkward, right? Nothing I can do about that. You just have to like, I just have to embrace that I say weird things and put my foot in my mouth and, you know, stand too far away from people when I'm supposed to stand close and don't shake people's hands when I'm not supposed to, and all these like not picking up on social cues at all, right? Socially awkward person, can't hide it, just have to deal with it. Have to find a way of managing the identity, right? Make sense? Okay. And that would be like a very minor version, right, of the kind of things we're looking at. Okay. So that's kind of the theoretical framework that we're starting with, right? Let's go ahead and go into the examples. So I'm going to skip over, like I always told you guys to do, the fieldwork section. We're off to findings. Okay, so let's take a look at the three different types of stigmatized identity we're looking at here. What's the first one our author talks about?
Being homeless.
Being homeless. First of all, where is this happening, this study? Who are the people that they're interviewing?
It's like a hostel or like people between the ages of like 16 and 21 who are homeless and drug users.
Yeah, so it's a hostel, right? Does anybody know what a hostel is? Anyone here ever stay in a hostel? They're not necessarily like you were. If you didn't know what a hostel was beforehand, you might assume it's like a homeless shelter or something. For those of you who have been to a hostel, what are they?
So they're kind of like a hotel, but not really, because you have like one bigger room that you could share with people like you don't know, and then there's like community bathrooms. It's kind of like a dorm, but like bigger and more people. And yeah, I don't know. That's how I describe it.
Yeah. Anyone else?
You say it's like a bed and breakfast kind of thing?
it's a little different. Bed and breakfast is schwank, right? And you all have your individual rooms.
It's really cheap and like a lot of people travel, like when you're traveling, like a lot of people stay there at night or whatever, and there's some like, yeah, there's some sketchy things that can go on. Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically like places that young people stay at if they're traveling because they're so cheap, right? So, I mean, it's been a long time since I stayed in a hostel because like I'm middle-aged and too grouchy and too hung up on my own cleanliness to stay at a youth hostel anymore. You know, they're called youth hostels for a reason. But anyways, like yeah, like you pay, the last time I went, I paid, I think, $12 a night. And it's basically like the last one I stayed in was basically like bunk beds lining the wall like it's a barracks, and it's co-ed. So both men and women sleep in the same room. And, you know, it's not super clean, it's not super comfortable, but it's a place to sleep, and, you know, you can I got bed bugs from the used hostel once. Anyways. Anybody here ever have bed bugs? Yeah. It's horrible. They're horrible. Anyways, that was the last time I stayed at a youth hostel because I got bed bugs. And it's weird because like not everybody can feel it. I'm sorry, this is a complete aside, but not everybody can like feel the bed bug bites, and I can't, and my wife can. So it like took forever for us to figure out what the heck was happening. She got diagnosed with weird stuff at the doctor because only one of us had it. Anyways, it was a whole mess. But anyways, so that's a youth hostel, right? So you have these young people staying at this cheap place, right? And yeah, okay. So this is essentially who he's interviewing, are these young people staying at this youth hostel. They live there rather than are traveling, right? Okay. So how did these young people at a youth hostel deal with their identity as homeless? This is actually tied in with the theme from earlier that I said I was bracketing out for a second. Yeah.
I guess they basically just distance themselves from it. Is that right?
Yeah, so how do they distance themselves? What do you mean by that?
A different definition of it, or whatever?
Yeah, so talking about, let's back up and I'll talk about role distance and role embrace, and then we'll move into, if you want to leap off of that. So like, in social psychology, there's this term called role distancing versus role embracing, and role embracing means that you like your role, and you're perfectly fine with it, and you're happy with it. So you perform that role regularly, like you want to perform it well, right? So like, anybody here have a part of their identity that they're particularly proud of and wouldn't mind sharing? It can be anything about you.
I'm part of the soccer team.
You're part of the soccer team. So in some ways, do you find yourself performing being somebody who plays soccer?
Yeah.
Like how do you do that?
Like when I'm not at practice.
Or even when you're at practice?
Just like wearing like my like soccer stuff like around campus or like at practice. Like wearing what I need to wear for practice.
Yeah. So you go around wearing soccer stuff around campus because you're proud of it. And then like what do you do when you go to practice because you like the fact that you're a soccer player?
When I practice.
You try hard, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't just blow it off, right? If you embrace your roles, like you try hard in them, you advertise them, they become a part of who you are, you tell people about them, right? And we all can think about things that are like that. Does anybody else have an example of something like that? A role that they embrace, that they really liked about themselves?
I'm an RA.
Okay, yeah. How do you show role embrace as an RA?
So I have the residence life mission, and I read it every morning, and I try and go out and do my best encourage them, and if I see people I know, I invite them to come, to my programs and stuff, and I'm a lot more inviting than I usually am. That sounds kind of like I'm mean. I'm not mean. I just try a lot harder to be more inviting now.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's what role embrace looks like. Well, anybody here have any roles that they're not proud of? Or have had, anybody here have a really crappy job ever? What are some of our crappy jobs?
I worked at Price Chopper. Out of grabbing carts.
Okay, so what was your behavior like when you were doing that?
I was mad all the time.
Anyone else? What were your jobs you didn't like?
I was a lifeguard at a water park.
Okay. Was it any signs of you not liking your job when you were there?
I mean, yeah, I was just annoyed all the time.
Have you ever like, if we think about, were you gonna?
I was gonna say, like, I like babysit a lot, and like some kids are way easier than others, so it's like I'll get more strict or more like, I don't know, my patience gets really thin, like really fast with some kids, so like that's just.
Yeah, yeah. And if we were to read this through social psychology, essentially what we're doing there, the difference in our behavior for the things we don't like, that's role distancing. I always think the archetype I think of, like, you ever see teenagers out with parents that they're embarrassed of? What kind of things do they do? Like body language wise, when they're really embarrassed about being with their parents.
They would not talk to them that much or like kind of distance themselves from them.
Yeah, they don't talk to them that much. They might stand further away even. What else might they do? Right? Roll their eyes, right? Like, look down at their phone. Like, is ever like, what is it called? There's a term for like when you look at your phone because you don't want to talk to somebody. I'm trying to remember what that's called. It was like a popular term in the media a few years ago. Oh, darn it, I've lost it. It got data dumped. But essentially, like most of the time, often when people are looking down at their phones, it's not because like they're actually doing anything. It's just because they don't want to talk to the people around them. But you see teenagers do that a lot, I think, with their parents, right? Who are embarrassed by them. Some of us like our parents. Some of us embrace our role as sons and daughters. But you often see people that don't, right? And that would be an example of role distancing. We perform it, right? Why is it that people are generally speaking rude at fast food restaurants? People who work at fast food restaurants. Why are they rude? Why don't they really talk to you? Why do you think that is?
I don't like being there. I don't like their job.
Yeah, it's a really crappy job, right? Like, you have no autonomy, you don't get to make any decisions, right? Not even the things you say, right? You have a script that you have to follow, right? Has anybody ever worked a job like that? I used to work at Subway and it was like that.
I worked at Subway.
Did you work at Subway?
Yeah, that was one.
That wasn't you? Who said that? Oh, way in the back. Yeah, so, yeah, is it still true at Subway that you have to say certain things at certain times? Or no? Did they change that?
What do you mean?
Like when somebody comes up to the counter, you have to like, you have a set thing you have to say.
Kind of greet them. You have like what kind of like bread and stuff they want to order. What they want heated or toasted. Like you have like assistants that kind of like how you like greet people too, and then when you say thank you, stuff like that.
Yeah. And I always found that when I did that, like I had a tendency just to be like, hello, welcome to Subway, like what can I get you started on with your bread? Like it was just like you didn't want to like, you just didn't want to put any energy into it, right? That's just role distancing. I'm annoyed that I can't just be like, hey, what's up, how you doing? Like, you know, instead I have to like, what's up?
That's how it was. My Subway was very strict, so you can make conversation. You know,
Oh, well yeah, when I did it, you had to like, you were not allowed, you would get yelled at if you talked to a customer and said something that wasn't on script.
that's fine.
Which, yeah, anyways, differences, right? So that's kind of role embrace and role distance, the ideas. So it talks about a particular form of distancing that they do here. So how are they distancing themselves from the role of being homeless? And this is something we often see with stigmatized identities.
Is it how they kind of like say that there's like two different sorts of homelessness? There's like the people who walk on the street and like ask for money, they're like, no, I don't know what those are called, but then he says that them, like the people at the hostel are like low homeless.
Yeah.
There's a low and high.
Yeah, the low and high homeless thing, right? So high homeless would mean what? That you are,
Sleeping on the streets and like asking for money.
yeah, essentially they use this as a language to be like, if you're high homeless, this is the language of the people at the hostel, right? Then you are really, really homeless. If you're low homeless, you're just kind of homeless. You're just a little homeless. Right, this is a distinction we regularly use for people who are homeless. Oh, he's just a little homeless. He's not homeless. He's just kind of homeless. Not usually, right? We often want to like divvy it up as a yes/no sort of thing. So what they're doing is, and this is called categorical distancing, right? Categorical distancing, and that's what they mean by it. It's a form of role distancing, where you essentially blame other people for being a worse version of your stigmatized identity. I read another study, I may have mentioned this study because it was a really interesting study, but I read another study about stigmatized identity that was somebody interviewing like people who drink at a bar at 9 in the morning. And he went there for like 4 years and he got to know everybody and like really got the ins and outs of how they felt and talked about themselves. But one thing that they would regularly talk about in terms of categorical distancing is there was another bar down the road. They'd be like, the alcoholics at that bar, those guys are real alcoholics. Like me, I'll sit here, I'll have 4 or 5 drinks, but then I'll go to work. You know, and I hold down a job, right? I'm not really an alcoholic. I'm an alcoholic, but I'm sort of an alcoholic, right? Everyone here, we're just generally, in this bar, like we're generally just sort of alcoholics, right? But that bar down the road, they go crazy. They're passed out by 10 o'clock in the morning. You don't want to go to that place, right? And of course he was going to both places and they're basically the same, right? But there's that distinction, that categorical distancing that people do, right? So like, you could think about like, you know, and we can make the same sort of delineation for any stigmatized identity. So if you think about somebody who's like, has anybody here known anybody who was an ex-con? Like somebody who had been in prison or something? Like, often, like, they'll delineate out if they didn't commit a very serious crime. It's like, well, I went to prison, but it was just for not paying child support. It wasn't anything important, right? Or I went to prison, but it was just a drug charge, right? Which is a form of categorical distancing, as in, like, there are other ex-cons, and those are the ex-cons that are really ex-cons. Like, I'm just sort of an ex-con, right? Does all that make sense? So you see them using that sort of categorical distancing. What else do we see them doing to avoid the stigma of homelessness? Just a couple other things that they do, or there's really just one other narrative that they really focus on. It kind of starts in the next column. Yeah.
They kind of say that, like, that is their home, and they go on like the quote with like Kara, like she's like saying like how sometimes she's like get away from her home, and so she makes a hostel around.
Yeah. So there's like this like they redefine what it means to have a home, and they call their hostel their home, right? This is actually really common with homeless people. If you've ever known homeless people, like a lot of times homeless people live in camps here in the United States. Has anyone ever interacted with homeless people? By the way, there's a great opportunity through the school to take part in helping with the homeless. I don't think we're doing it right now, but if you're a freshman and you continue on, Uplift does a lot of interesting stuff, and you can actually get to meet some homeless people. I didn't put this in here as a plug. I'm just throwing that out there. But homeless people often live in camps, and they'll often talk about their camps as a home, right? And you'll even hear people be like, well, I'm not really all that homeless. I have a tent. Like, and I live in this tent. And, like, I make it real homey. It's real nice and schwank inside. Like, I have good bedding and, it's clean and I'm not really homeless, right? And you hear people make that kind of distinction, right? And here you see them doing the same thing. They're redefining what it means to be at home so they can redefine homelessness. And they talk about the need to get out because essentially like they go a little stir crazy and they need to leave, and they think of that as a vacation, right? And that's sort of an analogy that they bring. All that makes sense? So those are how we see them distancing themselves from the role. Okay. One other thing you get is you get a lot of times people will use their past self as a way of distancing as well. So people will talk about, sure, I am, and once again, this is very common with like homeless people or drug users. Well, I may be this right now, but I used to be, right? And they'll often have very inflated versions of that, right? So it's like, I might be homeless right now, but I used to run my own company, right? And I used to really, and I have a college degree, and I ... right? I also want to point out, right, like part of this literature is kind of showing that people can't help but be a little dishonest sometimes. So when we think about what Goffman, how Goffman talks about us as the performer of roles, right? Most of our performances have elements of truth in them, but they're also kind of lies. So for Goffman, we're all kind of like lying to one another constantly. So a lot of times people will often accuse people with stigmatized identities of being not very truthful. That takes on a very different connotation within social psychology, because that is actually just them doing something very automatic for us human beings, which is preserving a positive sense of self. They'll often believe the things they say. And this is one of the things about not having a consistent identity, but constantly playing roles. If you view the world through this sort of social psychological lens, often we believe our own performances after a while, right? And actually, like, if you take on a role, so like you get a new job, right? And you've done it for a while, you get better at it, right? And part of that is like you actually like, you and that role kind of create a symbiosis. You become more that, right? So like a lot of you guys are freshmen here, being a college student is a new role. As you stay in this longer, you will get better at being a college student, both literally, like it'll get easier, but also like it'll be easier for you to perform it as an identity, right? So like our roles actually change who we are, but also like, and even when we think about like when we were talking about memory, right? Like people redefine themselves on the basis of playing these roles. So there's something dishonest about them already, right? So in a lot of ways, like for Goffman, we're all kind of con men, conning each other. And so if we're to understand like the more extreme forms of dishonesty that are practiced sometimes by people with stigmatized identities, it's only because they're placed in a position of having to do more extreme forms of performance. And so they actually do that, right? And it's something automatic, something that's just sort of built into us. So if you've ever known people who are, in this case, like something like homeless, like often they'll have very aggrandized explanations of themselves. And why do they do that? They do this to preserve a positive sense of self in light of the fact that most people hate them, right? And if you've ever known anybody who's homeless, like it sucks to be homeless, right? People throw things at you from their cars. You sometimes get injured. Sometimes cops beat you up, right? Like it's a dangerous, frightening lifestyle where 90% of the population thinks you shouldn't be alive. So thinking about like, this was like a few weeks ago, or no, it was a few months ago. The mayor of Kansas City attacked an organization that helps the homeless and says, homeless people are like dogs. If you feed them, they'll stay, is what the mayor said. Right? So you think about like, if people can say that kind of crap about you, right? Like, what does that do to your identity, right? What does that do for how you feel about yourself? What does that do for how other people treat you, right? And so, to some degree, sometimes dishonesty is a way of feeling okay about who you are, which is kind of the weird thing, right, about stigmatized identities. Does it make sense? So that's just something that's worth mentioning. So in the last part of this section where it talks about them talking about their old lives, their prior lives. That's kind of the meaning behind that. Past selves is the language it uses. Okay, drug users. How does them being a drug user differ from them being homeless? What kind of drugs do they use, first of all, these young people? What kind of drugs are they doing? What's that?
They're smoking weed.
They're smoking weed, right? So weed is illegal in England, right? This takes place in England, right? But they don't, okay, so how do they feel about their identity as somebody who smokes weed? How do a lot of people who smoke weed feel about their identity as someone who smokes weed?
I feel like they kind of like embrace it and don't like shy away from it.
Yeah, they're like, you're gonna, if you know people who smoke weed, like they're usually not all that embarrassed of the fact, right? Like they'll talk about it. There's a certain amount of role embrace happening here. So even though on one level we could think of it as a stigmatized identity, on another level, like they're perfectly comfortable with it and they perform it. What's a distinction they make here between, and this is a very common distinction for people who smoke marijuana?
It's like what?
What's the distinction that they make here? So just like before they were making a distinction between the really homeless and the not so homeless?
They talk about how like it's not that bad and like they're not, I think they use the term like junkies, like they're not, like they don't do anything like really bad, like it's just weed.
Yeah, so he's picking up on, and once again, like this isn't like the stigmatized identity stuff's not criticizing people, but the point is like he's picking up on the fact that around their smoking weed, they often make a lot of jokes about other people's drug use, right? They make fun of people, particularly in this case, heroin addicts, a lot. So there's like this running joke about heroin addicts, and almost like a joke about their marijuana also being like similar, but also not the same thing, right? So even though they have this role embrace, there's this running joke where they distance themselves from it, right? And there's even this conversation that they have about all the extreme things that they've done to be able to afford weed. Did you guys catch this part? And so what sort of things are they doing sometimes as homeless teenagers to buy weed?
Not eating.
They're not eating, they're lying to their parents. These are all kind of like classic like addiction behaviors, right? They're not eating, they're lying to people, they're stealing things, et cetera, right? So like some of these people they may very well have a problem, right? But there's various ways in which they negotiate that through this system of role distance and role embrace. I think, and I want to point out one thing about like if I have a hesitancy about this article at all, it's that some of these distinctions are things that I think are fair enough that the teenagers are making, right? Like there is a difference between living in a Utah still and being homeless. And I think there is a difference between smoking weed and being a heroin addict. But anyways, the third one is being young, but we're kind of out of time, so I think we'll just round it out there. And we can talk about that when we get back if you want, or we can leap straight into the drinking narrative. So we can talk about youth as a stigmatized identity if you like. It's up to you guys. So, have a good day. See you Friday.